And thank you very much for setting up this committee and keeping it going for so many years. On June the 28th, 2001, Slobodan Mилошевиќ was kidnapped, abducted in plain sight, completely illegally, in violation of the rulings of the Constitutional Court of Yugoslavia, in violation of the fact that there were no extradition treaties between the ICTY and Yugoslavia. He was kidnapped, bundled in a plane, and sent to The Hague. This is, preceded by 25 years what was done to Nicolas Maduro a couple of months ago. During the time of his imprisonment in The Hague, he spent the last 5 years of his life at The Hague. During that time, without any hope of acquittal, without any hope of seeing freedom, without any hope of seeing his family again, Slobodan Mилошевиќ presented a defense of the honor of Yugoslavia, a defense of the honor of the Serbian people. And more than that, he blazed the trail for an understanding of what the post-Cold War unipolar world was about. And even more important, he laid bare the dishonest, fake, fraudulent diplomacy, and I use the word quote mark, diplomacy that preceded the destruction of Yugoslavia. Now we're now familiar with these diplomacy. We see what happens in Iran, Libya, over and over again. But Yugoslavia was the first. It was the first of this new style of Western diplomacy, whereby you hold a conference, invite everybody, and pretend that you're going through a process of serious negotiations. The first of these was the International Conference for Yugoslavia, chaired by Lord Carrington, who was actually one of the among the better of the European diplomats. And there was some pretense that they were trying to work out maybe some possible confederation of Yugoslavia. All of that was completely dishonest. And everybody knew it was dishonest, because Germany had already announced, we're going to recognize Croatia and Slovenia come what may, we just don't care. And yet nonetheless, this conference and the EU, it was then called the European Community, went ahead and declared, well, we are not going to do anything unilaterally. It was completely dishonest. Of course, they were going to do everything unilaterally because it had already been decided that they were going to do something unilaterally. And so how do they get around it? They got around it by creating something called the Badinter Commission. The Badinter Commission involved the constitutional court chiefs of all the European countries. These are the most eminent legal minds in Europe. And what did these eminent legal minds do but came up with a completely ridiculous, the stupidest, most dishonest arguments for recognizing something that they were going to recognize anyway, because they knew Germany was going to recognize Croatia and Slovenia, so they had to come up with some idiotic legal reasoning that would provide some sort of a superficial understanding. Oh yes, well, okay, that's fine. What Germany is doing is not really illegal. It's enshrined in international law. And then time and again, we saw the same kind of dishonesty on the part of the Western powers. Remember the safe areas for the Serbs in Croatia? Well, that was, they went through the whole negotiation process, even though everybody knew and that Croatia was going to use force to seize these territories, drive out the Serbs. Everybody knew this. Germany and Austria were arming Croatia during those years, and yet they went through the process that, oh, this is all legally binding. And then, of course, came the utterly dishonest, we had references earlier, the dishonest Rambouillet negotiations. What were the Rambouillet negotiations about? Well, we know this. We know this from the admissions of the Western diplomats who were involved. And some of them are still around. Christopher Hill, the man who drafted the Rambouillet Agreement, who subsequently became an ambassador here. What was it about? They were seeking to bomb Serbia. They were seeking to bomb it. How were they going to bomb it? The way to bomb it was to present an agreement so egregious, so insulting, so humiliating for the Serbs that they were bound to say no. And then when the Serbs say no, that would provide the justification for the NATO bombing. It was, people are very preoccupied with what the Trump administration is now doing to Iran. This was the first. This was 25 years ago. It was even more egregious in some ways than what's being done to Iran right now. And that was the whole point. They summoned the Serbs to Rambouillet, and in the hope that the Serbs would say no. But the Serbs, led by kind of one of the great political geniuses of our era, Slobodan Mилошевиќ, knew exactly what was planned. He knew perfectly well that the goal was to get him to say no. And then the bombing can start. NATO can have its wonderful little party bombing Yugoslavia. But Mилошевиќ was much too clever for that and was prepared to accept the political aspect of the agreement. It was humiliating, totally dishonest, of course, whereby, I think Diana Johnston put it, Kosovo would be independent of Serbia, but Serbia would not be independent of Kosovo. But Mилошевиќ said, okay, well, that's a framework, we can work with that. What then happened? They had to insert something that was just so outrageous into that agreement. The demand for NATO occupation of the whole of Yugoslavia, that was absolutely guaranteed that the Serbs would say no. And the Serbs, finally had to say no, and that enabled the bombing to take place, which is the bombing that they'd wanted. So this was the crime that was committed against the Serbian people. It was preceded, of course, by years and years of a disinformation campaign, the kind of disinformation that we've now become used to, when it was applied against Iraq, applied against Libya, against Venezuela. It's a massive global disinformation in which suddenly a people that had once been admired, the Serbs, everyone remembered the Serbs, they were fought on the Allied side in 2 world wars, they were always known to be a very brave Christian people. Suddenly, they became monsters. And everybody suddenly it was decided that the Serbs are the most horrible, evil people imaginable. Again, we've now seen these kinds of campaigns waged against Russia, against others, and that preceded the bombing. And of course, we had the sanctions and everything else. So Mилошевиќ is taken to The Hague and what was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia? What was this court, which parades around in The Hague? I mean, there was a reason why they put it in The Hague. The Hague has this reputation that somehow, this is the International Court of Justice, United Nations. People supposedly take international law seriously. It was a mockery of international law. It was a mockery of what we understand as jurisprudence. It just simply made up the jurisprudence as it went along. It was staffed by lawyers from the NATO countries. Most, remember the chief judge in the Mилошевиќ trial, a man utterly pompous, vacuous, the kind of stupid person you come across in Great Britain all the time. And he absolutely knew nothing about Yugoslavia, absolutely nothing. He got into argument after argument with Mилошевиќ during the trial. Every single one of these arguments Richard May lost because he just simply knew nothing. He didn't know the language, didn't know the culture, didn't know the history. He didn't feel he needed to, because already the agreement, or rather the conviction, had already been drafted. I mean, it was already done, so they were just going through the motions, waiting until they can finally read out that judgment. Yes, Slobodan Mилошевиќ is guilty of crimes against humanity, genocide, whatever. Yes, he's guilty. So it was just simply a process, what is known as a kangaroo court, when everybody already knows the final outcome. And yet, nonetheless, Mилошевиќ, through extraordinary courage, presented his defense of the honor of the Serbian people, of the dishonest diplomacy that had preceded it. But so effective was his defense that essentially, because the arguments of the ICTY were ridiculous, as anybody who knows the history of Yugoslavia would know that Milošević was not a Serbian nationalist. He was a believer in the continued existence of Yugoslavia. And it was the easiest thing in the world for him to point out, here, I was the initiator of the Belgrade Initiative. I offered a partnership to the other peoples of Yugoslavia, including the Muslims. If the Croatian Slovenia wants to get away from Yugoslavia, okay, we can still have a workable Yugoslavia. A whole history of this. His support for every single Western peace agreement, the Van Zoen Plan, the Owen-Stoltenberg Plan, the EU Action Plan, every single agreement that was ever put forward by the Western powers, totally dishonestly. They were all absolutely dishonest agreements. Nonetheless, Milošević had supported. So this was a ridiculous for him, and he of all people, had insisted upon Yugoslavia remaining a federation of diverse people, of a multinational state that it had been. So ridiculous was this case that even at one moment in 2005, during the part of the defense case when Vojislav Šešelj was a defense witness, but at the moment when Šešelj pointed out that he, Milošević, had never been a nationalist like as Šešelj was, the judges themselves became completely lost. Because Šešelj had said, hey, he, Milošević, had never pursued the goal of a greater Serbia. He always was Yugoslavia. And the judges had no idea what is this case about. And they turned to the prosecutor, Jeffrey Nice, yet another ridiculous English jurist. They turned to him and to help us out. We've already got the conviction of Milošević already drafted. It's all done. We've got it filed away in our drawers, but we don't understand this case. What was it? Was he a supporter of Yugoslavia, or was he a supporter of Greater Serbia? That was a measure of how effective Milošević's defense had been at the ICTY, that the fact that the judges themselves had no idea any longer what they were supposed to be arguing about. So then, a few months later, Milošević dies. The circumstances are somewhat dubious. No one ever bothered to undertake a proper investigation. But what we can conclude from that is that ultimately people can sacrifice themselves, they can act with bravery, with great heroism, and they can restore the dignity and freedom of their people and blaze a trail for others, to inspire others. This is what you need to do in order to defend the freedom and integrity of your own people. Thank you very much.